So it's the story of one particular flow of oil, or one oil road as we call it, from the Caspian Sea to refineries in southern Germany, Czech Republic and Austria, in the central part of Europe. But it's also the story of how oil has come to underpin our lives, and how structures like this are built both by corporate interests, finance, of banks and so on, and companies, and by political interests. And I'm interested in the way in which the US, for example, has a particular role in that. Last night I was giving a talk around the book in Washington, and down in DC, and a place called Busboys and Poets.
I know it well. Yeah.
And there I was explaining how this structure, which runs about 4,000 miles in total, and was built over a period of, between the late 60s and early 2000s, mid 2000s, was essentially created in the State Department. Although it's out there in far off lands, from far away from US, in the regions of the Caucasus and Central Europe, it was essentially created here in the US. The State Department was one of the main drivers in the whole principle of accessing oil and gas in the Caspian Sea by Western oil companies, and building a pipeline so that the oil flowed in an area where it was outside Russian control. So in a sense it was set up, it was created as a geopolitical project. Now the people who live along that route of that pipeline, they suffer from the impacts that it has on their daily lives, both the fact that the corridor in which the pipeline is laid is basically turned into a military zone, and the impact of the construction, and also the impact of the threat of leaks and pollution from the pipeline in itself, and also indeed from the tanker routes and the further pipeline as well. So these structures, which are created for geopolitical reasons largely, as well as financial reasons, have huge impacts on individuals' lives on the route of the flow.
Did this get started under the Bush-Cheney administration? Because they were big on the oil companies.
No, actually, the beginning process of this happened under George Bush Sr. and Secretary of State George Shultz in the 80s, in '89, where the policy in Washington, which was a continuation of the Reagan era, which was to basically pull the states of southern Soviet Union out of the sphere of Russia. So we're talking Georgia, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, take them out of that political sphere to, in a sense, roll back the imperial advance of Russia of the 18th century and pull those states out of the Russian sphere of influence. And part of the way of their doing that was to build this oil pipeline. The thing really got underway under the Clinton administration, under Clinton and Madeleine Albright, and then was continued with alacrity under Bush and Colin Powell, and essentially it's still being pushed by the Obama administration and under John Kerry. At the moment there's another plan to build a similar pipeline in parallel with it, which would transport gas from offshore gas fields in the Caspian to Europe. And a pipeline which running about 4,000 kilometers from Azerbaijan through Georgia, Turkey, Greece, Albania and Italy. There's a number of things that are very interesting about that for me, which is that, first of all, that those structures, although created again in these countries and driven very strongly by the US, are actually not going to provide any energy to the US. More or less not a single cubic meter of gas, for example, will come to the US during it's about 40-year lifetime, if it happens. And yet it's pushed as being part of the US energy security structures, and it's been pushed in Congress as such, and by the ambassador in Azerbaijan, Richard Morningstar. Now, for me, it also interestingly relates to the question of gas in this area, in Maryland and in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. At the moment, there's a big struggle taking place over the issue of fracking. across the US as well as elsewhere in the world. But it's interesting to me that it's particularly acutely being fought in the Chesapeake watershed. So you've got Pennsylvania, which is, you know, up the Susquehanna and up the Delaware, where fracking is going full scale ahead. You've got New York State, which is partly within the watershed, up the Delaware, where there's a big debate happening because New York's got a moratorium against fracking. You've got Virginia, which is the headwaters of the James, feeds into the Chesapeake Bay, and there's a big debate about whether, and a battle about to begin, whether or not there should be fracking in the George Washington National Park. It's interesting to me, for example, that the water supply company for Washington DC has said they don't want fracking in the water supply system of the city of Capitol Hill, and that would mean basically some kind of opposition to fracking in the Appalachians, because Appalachians is basically where you're getting water to come to the capital. So all the way across the Chesapeake Bay watershed, there's a big battles going on about fracking, and that's a similar issue to what we're talking about, because it's about the relationship between the drive of finance and politics to push forward fossil fuels and the opposition of that from people. And part of the reason why people are driven to oppose it is precisely the threat that it poses on the environment. And most interestingly, both cases on water. Biggest threat that fracking poses is to water. And so I think that there's a continuum here of these huge oil and gas infrastructure projects, their threat to people, their threat to water, but also the growing opposition to them, the very strong opposition that is growing all around the world, but you see it very acutely here in the Chesapeake Bay region.
Now, you mentioned some of the areas that were part of the former Russian Empire under Stalin. In fact, he was born in one of those provinces.
He was born in Georgia, that's right.
Yeah. And the question came up, there was a professor at Berkeley, Chalmers Johnson. He wrote 3 books dealing with our empire. And he speculated that this gas line that you're talking about is one of the reasons we got into Afghanistan. One of the real reasons that we went in there is to protect maybe that other side of that line that you're talking about, or some of it.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting, I think, is that there's very often an oil story or a gas story behind a conflict. I mean, there was the issue behind Afghanistan as to whether or not there was a pipeline, which was in fact proposed by Unocal to run from Central Asian states through Afghanistan to the Pakistani coast and deliver gas into the international market through a port on the Pakistani coast. Now, I think there really was a pipeline, and we looked at it ourselves, being planned. I don't think it's likely to be built anytime soon. What I think is interesting, though, is that although it was a factor in the war in Afghanistan, I don't think it was the driving factor. My feeling is that we all know in our own personal lives that when we get into a fight with somebody, there are loads of reasons why it is. There might be the thing that triggers it, but actually there's a lot of other issues. And of course, in Afghanistan, the driving thing that triggered the war was the apparent war on terror. I don't think it was triggered by the gas pipeline, but I think it was an issue and indeed remains an issue. Again, part of the principle about such a gas line would have been to deliver gas from Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, which traditionally had fed hydrocarbons north into Russia, to push that gas south into international waters off Pakistan, and so again pull those parts of the economy of those states, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, out of the Russian sphere of influence.
Other than raising the consciousness of the American people with your book, what is it you hope they will do about this situation?
Well, the work that I'm part of with Platform, we have a very clear intent. What we're trying to do is to push as hard as we can with as many people as possible, both in us, within the group we're in, but also a wide network of people in the UK and internationally, to push against the oil and gas industry. We feel very strongly that we need to move out of fossil fuel dependency in our culture, in our industry, in our economy, as fast as possible, as rapidly as possible. And part of the way of doing that, I think, is grabbing and trying to understand what it is that we're doing and how it works. The intention of the book is to make the invisible visible. These things, a pipeline, if you told me you're writing a book about a pipeline, most people would fall asleep because it's so boring. But because it's generally considered something off the range of things that we should be interested in. Our job with the book is to make it interesting and make it gripping to the imagination, try and make it a thing in the public imagination, a consciousness. And because until we can understand these things, until we can make them a thing which we can grapple with, then we can't really overcome them. As an interesting example of that is that, or counterbalance to that, the drive to fracking in this watershed as well as elsewhere is developing up the idea of leading to the development of a pipeline system which would probably deliver to a new terminal at Cove Point, a liquid natural gas terminal, to export that gas.
There's a lot of
globally.
Dispute about that.
There's a lot
locally.
of dispute about that. But one of the ways in which we can tackle that, those kinds of structures, is to bring them into the public domain, to bring them into stories, to bring them into culture, and to make sure that they're not just put over at one side as something in the domain of a technical problem which technocrats have to deal with and is none of the business of general citizens. So the function of a book, especially a book which is written for very general readership and is written as a travel book, it's a light read hopefully, is a way of placing it back into the culture, because that's the way we can grab hold of it and do something about it.
What is carbon pollution, and why is that so important about this story? What is it? Where does it come from?
Well, very simply, say for example in the case of what we're talking about here, this oil pipeline, the oil that it exports was a forest which was 5.3 million years old and was laid down 5 miles underneath the Caspian Sea, deep under the rocks of the Caspian Sea. And what the structures of finance have done is to build an oil rigs, 7 oil rigs out in the sea, plunge a hole into that old forest and pump it out and then pump it across the world. And eventually, as it's burnt in the combustion engines, like we can hear the ones going down their street, it goes into the atmosphere and delivers carbon into the atmosphere. Essentially what these structures are doing is taking carbon, which is 5 million years old, and taking it out of the lithosphere, the place of rocks, and throwing it into the atmosphere, the place of air. And the result of that is that we're radically altering the climate, which in itself is having enormous range of impacts, and one of the biggest impacts it has is on water. We come back to this question of water. If the climate changes, the Chesapeake Bay, for example, will be radically affected, and we're already beginning to see that here and elsewhere. So we need to deal with this question of moving carbon from beneath the lithosphere into the atmosphere. Of course, it seems like an impossibly difficult challenge. We can say, well, how are you going to live? Look at all these cars and so on and so forth. But actually, personally, I think it's not all that hard a challenge, because we have to remember that the only reason why that carbon is moved from the bottom of the sea to the atmosphere is to generate money. It's only to generate money. It's to generate return on capital. Of course, it helps us move around, but we can find other ways of moving around. Of course, it helps us heat our houses, but human beings have lived in this space for about 10,000 years, and they've had other ways of heating houses. Only started using oil and gas in the last 60 years at any large level. Of course, they used coal before that, but only for the previous 100 years or so before that. It's a fraction of a time that human beings have lived here, and we'll just have to learn how to live our lives, which we can do very successfully with great happiness and joy, without using this structure of carbon. And we can do that.
Now, James, you're on a book tour. You're in Baltimore tonight, and last night you were in Washington at the Busboys and Poets, which is a rather popular venue. Where are you going next?
Tomorrow I'm going to talk in New York to some people on Wall Street, investors, people working in finance, and then at the weekend I'm going down to New Orleans, where I meet my co-author and my colleague Anna Galkina. And
is she an Italian?
No, she's Russian.
Oh, Russian. Okay.
They're going to do a number of events down in New Orleans and Mobile and Houston and so on. The
folks down there are still recovering from what happened in the Gulf of Mexico. Yep. Some have called it ecocide. We'll probably never know the full extent of the damage that's been done. So there are parts of this country, and then the other day they had these bad floodings in Colorado. I think it was Colorado.
Yes.
And they're wondering, they might have been doing some fracking out there. I'm not sure. But they're wondering what happened after that thing, when they take a look at it, what kind of damage was done. And so that'll be new things, new challenges for the American people.
Yeah.
So finally, James, what else would you like to add here?
Well, I think it's interesting because if we look at, say, the Gulf of Mexico, what happened there, the spill, there needs to be some kind of justice. Justice is very hard to deliver in many cases, especially when you're faced with power. In the case of this spill, there's a court cases going ahead, but it will be drawn out, and of course it won't really deliver justice, because after all, the impact that was had there on the ecosystem and the communities all along the Gulf was the result of a decision by perhaps 10 people. We know the names of about 3 of those in detail. John Brown, who was the head of BP up until 2007. Tony Hayward, who was the head of BP up until 2010. Byron Grote, who was the chief financial officer of BP up until about 2011. Now those people and a whole set of others together, with only about 10, 20 people perhaps, made a series of decisions driven by their own desire to generate profit, or return on capital. They made a series of decisions which led to the cost cutting, which led to that accident happening. It wasn't an act of God. It was a calculated risk that they took that went wrong. They decided to err on the side of making more money, and they made a misjudgment. A whole team of people made a misjudgment, and the result of that is huge pollution. Now, if somebody drives down this street and decides that they're in a hurry, and they make a calculated, perhaps not very calculated, risk to drive twice the speed limit, and they hit a kid, and the kid's killed, they'll go to jail.
Yeah.
I don't understand why the people who made that risk, took that risk, are not in jail, and in fact are extremely wealthy and extremely rich and extremely honoured. It seems to me that justice hasn't been served. And I don't think it'll really be served by the court case that is happening at the moment, because the judgment there is only against the company and not against the individuals, which is a curious idea. It's a bit like making a judgment against the car company that you drive when you knock over a kid, rather than yourself, because you actually killed that person. But I'm an optimist. I think that justice will be served. It may take time. Yeats said a rather nice thing, I thought, which is, he said that their children's children's children will say that they have lied. And what he meant by that was that justice sometimes takes time, a long time, but it will be served, and I hope sooner than later. Basically.
In one of your great men of letters, Shakespeare said, "Time's glory is to unmask falsehood and bring truth to light." Yeah.
That's very nice.
Yeah,
I didn't know
nice.
that.
I quote it from time to time myself.
Yeah. Time's glory
is to unmask falsehood and bring truth to light.
And bring truth to light.
It's about, it's more than that. It's at least 10 lines to it. One of his sonnets, yeah. Yeah.
That's great.
Render justice. Yeah. So he's right on the money.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think you are too, James. That people will wake up not only on this issue but the other issues.
Yeah.
So thank you so much.
No problem.